This is Alec.
And this is Jack.
Welcome to another episode of Smith and Scholar. Smith and Scholar is a multimedia project dedicated to promoting and encouraging young men to pursue and live the good life. All right, well, today we are talking about justice, our third cardinal virtue. We've already talked about prudence and
temperance.
Yes. It's, we have a little bit of time in between our episodes, so sometimes we don't always remember our last topic. But the important thing is that we're here and you're here listening to continue on our little adventure through the four cardinal virtues before we move on to some other topics. So, justice, as I mentioned in our overview, was one of the ones I was most interested in talking about, partially because I think the world has a misplaced sense of justice nowadays, or maybe people, specifically, when they think of justice, they don't necessarily think of the same thing with everybody. But while I was the most interested, Jack is actually going to be leading this discussion and kind of lesson today because he is a lawyer in training, and so he has undergone lots of studies and whatnot in terms of justice, law, and how we go about that. So, Jack, why don't you go ahead and get us started with the definition of justice?
Sure. And to start, most simply, justice is giving each man his due. As Joseph Pieper put it, we've been using Pieper to pave the way here for us. He describes the virtue of justice as a habit whereby a man renders to each one his due with constant and perpetual will. We can see that justice is very other-focused. It's very directed towards the other. And again, like we've seen with the other virtues, because again, they're habits that have to be formed, they're actions. So justice is an action. It's something that we will. So I think we need to break this down a little further and talk about first what it means to say each man's due. What is each man's due?
Yeah, so one way to look at this, specifically through the lens of Pieper, which, as Jack mentioned, we are relying a lot on for these four cardinal virtues. He's definitely in there for the fourth one, which is fortitude. But he sees it that nothing is due to man without right, and every man possesses right by nature. So there is this understanding that there is some sort of rule or necessity of being or order in the universe, and we see that as natural law, which, again, is not necessarily taught at all law schools nowadays.
Not at all.
But ought to be. And so another way to look at this is if there are these there's this natural law where people are owed something, it also requires some prudence to recognize what that person might need. So I also want to say that when we see each man's due, rendering to each man's due, Jack did emphasize that it's other-focused. When we look at prudence and we look at temperance, we also see that those might be a little bit more, I don't want to say self-focused because the virtues...
Mm-hmm. More so temperance than prudence, but yes, I think there's a little less... Justice is explicitly very much, and as we'll get into, about relationships in a way, as are all the virtues, but the way in which you understand justice is very relational, so it is just naturally more other-focused.
Exactly, and so Pieper has a great quote, and Jack, why don't you go ahead and read that?
Yeah, tying it into this understanding of, what we're talking about, natural law, and again, Pieper being a Christian is an atomist in particular, ties that in. He says, man has inalienable rights, which is a term us all Americans should know. It's in the Declaration of Independence. Man has inalienable rights because he has created a person by the act of God, and that is an act beyond all human discussion. And so there's something uniquely inherent to man as a creature that makes justice particularly relevant, that makes the relationships that we have with each other, with our community, that give rise to the need for justice, and we can get into that a little more now. Particularly, as we'll discuss it, in these three forms or types of justice. So, Alec, you want to start us off talking a bit about what we mean when we talk about the three forms of justice?
Sure. And so, like I emphasized earlier, it's very relational, relationship dependent. If you were to try and carry out justice in the absence of others, it might not be justice. It might just be, thinking or saying something rather than actually carrying out an action. And Jack alluded to this earlier, being something of the will. So it is action, but it also has to have an object of the action. So in many times we see it's other people or we'll get into that. So the first type of justice is commutative justice. So Jack, why don't you go ahead and break that down a little bit?
Yeah, so commutative justice is justice between individuals. It's reciprocal, mutually exchanged justice, which orders the relationship between individuals. So when we talk about commutative justice, it'd be the justice between you and I, Alec, or between you and your wife, or between you and your child, or between me and my brother. And so we kind of maybe most realize these things through such actions as restitution and recompense. And this makes sense because restitution is making someone whole. So, for instance, for like the very act of exchanging goods with another person, let's we can go agricultural. When someone farms and grows crops and then they sell them to you, the exchange of goods, the blood and sweat that they put into growing the crops, and then the giving of the goods to you has to be recompensed. There has to be some restitution. That's where we pay them. Or, when we see, like if I back my car out of Alec's driveway and ding, his wife's car, I'm gonna have to owe Alec some money for the damage I've done to his car, and that would be the fulfillment of justice in a way between Alec and myself, making Alec whole again.
Yeah, and I think it takes some insight to recognize what whole is or what is just in terms of that recompense or that giving back. And a lot of the examples that you used were monetary, and I think nowadays it's pretty clear to see. When you're paying for a good, you want to get your money's worth. That's a very large emphasis, and why we have so many reviews on Amazon or TV shows or movies is people want to get their money's worth.
Well, another thing that comes to mind is in law. You said I've been learning the law. One of the things we talk about is remedies, right? When a party is aggrieved, what are the remedies? They have to make a prayer for a remedy. They have to ask, and a lot of times in cases, a party will say, well, monetary damages doesn't do enough to make me whole again. There has to be some sort of other remedy. So that's when you start talking about what the courts call equitable relief. You're trying to make things equitable. And so those are things like injunctions, trying to get a party to stop doing something, that sort of thing.
All right. So let's go ahead and move on to the second type of justice, which is distributive justice. Jack?
Yeah, so this is ministering justice. By ministering, we mean it's sort of the way in which you would, I guess, maybe like the relationship between the community and its individuals. So like not individuals as a group, but each individual individually with the community or the polis at large. So it's the justice which orders that relationship between the community and individuals. And the way I think it gets kind of most easily illustrated is oftentimes in old kind of medieval understanding of things, like the king and the peasants that live under him, and the peasants, they farm and they provide goods and services for the polis, and the king's responsibility is to protect them, or you could say even like the Lord and his manor and those who live on the land in that sort of way. We always see in like the movies and stuff, the bad Lord is the Lord who takes advantage of the peasants, but the good Lord is the one who lives in harmony with them, and for the goods that they provide, for the services they provide, his land, he's supposed to protect them and take care of them and make sure that they're able to live and thrive. So I think that's a good way of understanding this idea of distributive justice.
Yeah, I think a modern example of this is the HOA.
Yeah.
So you put your money towards the HOA, and then they have the responsibility. Well, first of all, you have the responsibility to pay them so that they can upkeep the community, and then their responsibility is to actually carry out that upkeep. So whether it's sending letters or fining people for not following or abiding the rules. It's you can see how it starts in one place and then kind of spreads about. Similar with the Lord spreading amongst the peasants, it's the HOA with the whole neighborhood. And I guess, a lot of people look at the HOA in a negative light, especially if you get a letter from the HOA. But just remember that maybe it's just, so you should try and follow what's going on there. Okay, and that brings us to the last part, because if you don't follow what they're asking you to do, you may face some ramifications in the terms of legal justice. So, Jack, why don't you kind of tell us what that means?
Yeah, so legal justice is the type of justice that orders the member's relationship to the social whole. So you're not just as an individual in distributive justice, but as, we're in Houston, as your relationship as a Houstonian to the social whole. So this broader idea. And so, like Alec mentioned, there might be repercussions when you don't do things. So that's why we have systems of, we have penal codes to punish people for their illegal behavior. We have fines. And those things are supposed to teach you that there's a sort of understanding that there are things that you don't do in a community because you're trying to order everyone to the good of that community. And so that legal justice seems to be a little more exacting in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially with legal justice, it's the one that we can see most clearly in terms of justice, because we have police officers who help enact or carry out legal justice, and then the courts and all those bodies that are kind of represented by our legal system.
Right.
So. Yeah.
And, having gone through all three of these, I think the first thing you see, there's some similarities and some differences, but I think the key similarity between all these, and it comes with the definition of justice, is talking about, what justice being what is due to each man. All three of these have some form of indebtedness to them, though that indebtedness is different. But that we know that something is due to someone when we're talking about justice. It just depends. What is due to the tax man, what is due to the HOA is different than what is due to your spouse or your child, for example. And that's, I think, because ultimately, as we're discussing, those relationships are different, and they call for different things and different actions.
Yeah, and it takes the prudence to know the difference. You don't pay your child a certain amount of money in order for the child to upkeep the roads. That's due to the city or the state or the federal government in order to do those. And similarly, you don't clean your house to appease the federal government when they need your money to do other things. So I think we can understand that, yes, there's different levels of indebtedness, and what that means for different groups may differ. But that's the similarity that they share. But what about some of the differences?
Right. So each of these understandings of justice has a different subject. Like we said, whether it's commutative and it's the relationship between two individuals, and so the subject of justice is different. Where in distributive justice it's the individual to the community, and then in legal justice it's like the ordering of that individual as a member of the community to the social whole. But we can see, again, another similarity that in each of these, it is the individual man that does the ordering, right? Again, it's because it's that perpetual will thing that Pieper emphasizes when he talks about justice. It's choosing to exercise your will in a way so that to each man is given his due. But the difference is, again, the understanding of there being a different subject. So, for instance, commutative justice being sustained by the individual towards the individual, distributive justice being sustained by the ruler, like we were talking about, towards the individuals, and then legal justice being sustained by the individual, but as a member of the community. And also, I think you could say that the community sustaining it towards the individual in a way, because I guess when talking about legal justice and, particularly like punishment or fines and sort of thing, you're doing it because you're trying to make sure that justice is rendered to the members of the community as a whole.
Yeah, so while there are confusions, I think, broadly about what justice might be or what might be just or unjust, we're not going to discuss whether taxes are just or alimony or something like that is just. Those are totally different conversations that need to be understood in light of what justice is. We're going to talk about, similarly like we did for both prudence and temperance, kind of the two extreme scales of what justice can look like. So the framing might be a little bit different from what we've just talked about in terms of indebtedness and relationship. And we've kind of given some examples of what justice ought to look like or what it ought not to look like. So the first one I wanted to talk about is specifically in regards to legal justice when the, I don't want to say offender because that's more of the negative term, but the one who is in debt does not fulfill their debt to society. And again, in terms of legal justice. So why might that be like, not justice?
Yeah,
sorry, the wording was a little bit confusing. So the individual has owes a debt to society and does not pay that debt back. So and society does not require them to pay that debt back.
Well, then, I mean, obviously, there's a lack of justice there because there's a debt owed, and society isn't requiring it. So I guess are you getting at this understanding of there not being an exaction of that debt, like as far as legal justice goes, like maybe the understanding of punishment?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I mean, again, I think you could take the approach like you were saying, and talking about virtue as we have, there being this balance between the mean between two extremes, and the problem with there not being anything extracted from him is now you have there's in a way there's a hole, and maybe it would be better to concretize this a little bit better with an example, and I mean the easiest way to think about it, because we're talking about owed, I don't want to keep using monetary examples, but think about if someone committed fraud, right, against a community, and I'm not mean like an individual, like let's say that like you live in a small town and someone rips off, or we could even say rips off. So let's think about it. Have you ever seen The Music Man?
No.
Okay, so in The Music Man, it's a musical. And the main character is Harold Hill, and his whole thing, he's a con man, and he goes into towns, and he sells musical instruments to the kids, and the promise to the parents is, I'm going to turn these guys, they're going to be great musicians, it'll keep them out of trouble, that sort of thing. And he goes from town to town and does this. Now, this story is he gets stuck, falls in love, and so he doesn't want to leave, and, they find out, and it's all happy, hunky-dory in the end. But think about that. This man is committing a fraud. He has no intention. He's not even going to make sure that the instruments get there. He's taking their money and he's running. And so all of a sudden you have all these members of the community who are, owed money, but also that they kind of had this reliance interest. They're like, okay, you're going to do this for us. And if the community said, like the community leaders as a whole said, that's okay, we're just going to let him go on. There would really be there'd be a real problem with that, right? Like there'd be, like it takes, you can kind of see it's like he's physically taking something away from the community, whether it's their money or their goods or their reliance, their determination to make their sons better men by having them play musical instruments and be part of this and not sitting on the street corner watching the guys in the billiards hall shoot pool. But there's something missing there. And so when the community, fails to exact something from that, there's certainly there's a hole left, and that's the problem with when there is no punishment at all. There's a hole there. There are people who are hurt, and something needs to be done in order to make them whole again.
Yeah, and I think it's not just damaging to the community who has now has an unpaid debt, but it's also damaging to the individual, the transgressor, because he also has this false sense of it's okay to continue this behavior, which is not virtuous behavior. So it wouldn't be just on the side of the community who says, okay, we're not going to press charges, or we're not going to demand payment or the goods that were promised in the contract. And then it's also unjust, again, on the individual who carried out the fraud because he failed to deliver on his promise.
Okay. Yeah, I like that idea. And I guess then we could talk about it the other way is, what if this individual has gone and transgressed, and the mob runs him down, and they decide, all right, we're going to strap this guy to the electric chair and get him for committing this crime against our society. And I think that would be, so again, here it's not the lack of the fulfillment of giving each man to do. It's almost like an overcommitment. But I think I like this idea of focusing on the transgressor, because here you can see more clearly the transgressor isn't getting what he's due because he's being, he's committed a crime, but it's definitely not one that warrants the loss of his life. And so in that regard, it's almost like justice isn't being done to him at all. Yeah. It's not even it's not like they're overdoing justice. They're just not doing him justice at all. And then in a way, you're also not doing justice to the members of the community, because you're depriving them of, what is truly due to them is making them whole again. But instead you're not even doing that. You're going above and beyond what justice would require in this situation.
Yeah. So that's two ways to look at it, where you don't have any justice carried out, or you go beyond what is just for the individual, and then it's no longer just. So I also want to talk about some other factors that kind of it's not necessarily exactly what justice is, but kind of ways in which we think or kind of act out justice. So one of them that I was thinking about is the idea of scruples. And scruples is the idea that you have a guilty conscience, but I would say unjustly so, because you think you are committing grievous or heinous crimes, but in reality, you're not doing anything wrong, or maybe it's something minor. And one reaction to scruples is to turn yourself in, or let people know that you have this debt to pay, even if you don't really owe a debt.
That's interesting. One of the things that kind of brings to mind in that regard is in the Christian context, like being overly scrupulous, right? When you're as a Christian, you're supposed to think and evaluate, do an examination of conscience in the Catholic tradition, and think about your transgressions, which is a good way of thinking about justice, I think, because you really can determine where you failed to give the other what is due to him. This understanding that what is the quote? The quote is there are like two lies that Satan tells a person. The first one is that you can't, you can do it, you can get away with it, and then the second one is after you've done the bad thing, is trying to convince you that there's no way that you could ever be forgiven for it. So in a way, I think that's what the problem with that is you don't have a proper sense of justice for yourself. Which is interesting, because actually, in a way, the way we've been talking about it relationally with the other, but in this way, we're talking about what justice is owed to yourself. Yes.
And so the flip side of that, which is the first lie of the devil, is that you can get away with it. And this is the idea of not having a conscience, or not feeling any guilt or remorse for unjust actions. So I think that's another way that we can look at justice, or misrepresentation of justice, or especially when we're thinking about, as you mentioned, Jack, how to carry out justice kind of internally. So if you are willing to commit heinous, grievous crimes, and then not feel any remorse, or not feel as if there's a debt to be paid to community or those that you offended, then I think that would also be a misplaced sense of justice, or at least an internal view of how it is.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then I guess another example, one last example that we've kind of talked about, is this idea of favoritism. Do you want to weigh in on that a little bit? What we've talked about?
Yeah. So the way that I see favoritism, and this is maybe in the idea that when justice ought to be doled out, or somebody ought to repay their transgressions to society or individual, it's kind of similar to the idea of no punishment. But it's the idea that whoever is supposed to make the individual pay back ends up not requiring that of the individual and letting them go. So I remember I had some additional comments on favoritism, but I can't remember them at the moment.
Well, I mean, I was kind of thinking it in regards to, I mean, we could lay this out in terms of, at least to me, in terms of distributive and commutative justice. So we can start with commutative. So for instance, you've talked about this before, doing justice to your son, like what is justice between your son? So in the future, if you have more kids, like, it would be unjust for you to treat, one child, outright all the time as the favorite, right? Like that we just kind of like have that natural inclination, like that'd be unjust, as two men with siblings. You kind of have that natural reaction, like So I mean, I can admit my brother is the baby, and so he's just naturally the favorite, right? So but you know what I mean, like
yeah.
And then like I think maybe we see this more. Maybe it's more egregious in the understanding distributive justice when you have a ruler or some organization that favors one individual or a group of individuals, particularly when it comes to things that should be equitable or equal. And so that's a way in which favoritism is a lack of justice. And I guess you could also argue that sometimes it kind of goes both ways, though. I can maybe not favoritism, but maybe paying more particular attention to something or someone at a time. And so that's the thing about where prudence comes in, right? I think particularly maybe for this example is prudence helps you to determine what is due, to each man. And you've mentioned this earlier. So if we're trying to understand justice and holding this understanding that justice is giving to each man his due, you have to first understand what is due to each man, and prudence is definitely a very integral part to that understanding.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for summing up what I was thinking about favoritism in the past. As soon as you made it the relational aspect, I was like, yes, that's what I was trying to get at. So thank you for that, Jack.
Well, do you have anything else to add then about that, or?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I think you summed it up pretty well.
Okay. And I mean, I think we're kind of at the end here of our ideas, but I maybe one thing I would charge our listeners with is we're kind of in a world right now where people complain about whether there's a lack of justice or whether there needs to be justice carried out, and maybe it's kind of a fun maybe not a game, but like a fun way to think about justice is when you see things going on in the world and people say there's a lack of justice here, or if someone's being unjust. I think because of the way in which we've laid out this definition, maybe it'd be a good way to run what happened through your head and be like, okay, given the parties in this situation, what was due to each man? Was there a failure on one or both parties to render to the other what is due to them? And then in that way, I mean, and it's not perfect, right? Like that's super hypothetical and it doesn't get down to the nitty gritty. But I think it's a good way of thinking about it, and it helps us to conceptualize justice in our world, even if not perfectly. And it can be a good way to help you develop prudence and figuring out what is due to each man, and then thinking about what is the best way to go about willing what is due to each man.
Great. Well, I think that about sums up justice.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Smith and Scholar. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on all the major platforms, including YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Also, follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with everything we are doing and thinking.
Finally, feel free to give us feedback and ask questions across the different platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Smith and Scholar.